Good afternoon. I'm Faye Malarkey-Black with the Regional Airline Association. This afternoon, it's my pleasure to welcome two of our good friends at REA, Bill Swellbar and Mike Whitman from MIT. They're joining us today to discuss their latest study entitled Trends and Market Forces Shaping Small Community Air Services in the United States. The study comes at a critical time for us at the RAA, just as our industry is bracing for a number of new regulatory impacts that could serve to undercut air service to small and medium-sized communities. So their study, we're pleased to see, is starting to get some of the attention that it deserves. In fact, you might have seen it, page B1 of this morning's Wall Street Journal, so congratulations. Bill Swellbar is well known to many of us at RAA. He's built his career as a 25-year aviation consultant for various stakeholders on aviation issues, ranging from labor cost restructuring to air service development. Bill is presently a research engineer at MIT's International Center for Air Transportation. He's affiliated with the Global Airline Industry Program and Airline Research Consortium. He's also on the board of directors of Hawaiian Airlines Holdings. Bill's widely published on aviation issues, so you probably know his name, probably because of the amount of time that he spends with RAA. And you also may have come to know him as the author of the popular and, dare I say, occasionally controversial aviation blog aptly titled swellblog.com. Today is special not just because it's Bill's 4th visit with us here at RAA, but also because it's his birthday. So Bill, we're awfully glad that you've chosen to spend your 29th birthday with us.
Yep.
Joining Bill today is his MIT research assistant, Mike Whitman. Mike is also a member of MIT's International Center for Air Transportation, where he focuses on quantifying the impacts of recent macroeconomic events and airline strategies on U.S. airports. Mike has also done research on consumer complaints and airline services, and he's also worked on flight volume forecasting for the FAA. You might not know Mike's name yet, but let me assure you, you will. Mike and Bill have been frequent flyers at RAA's headquarters as they've gathered information for this study. And we've come to know Mike as an impressive, sharp mind. He has a great aptitude for understanding the complexities of the airline industry, and I think specifically with respect to the regional airline side of the business, he gets it. Mike will no doubt continue to make his mark on aviation, and we're very glad to have him here with us today. So please join me in offering a warm welcome to Bill and Mike.
Thank you, Faye. This is one of those rare occurrences where Swellbar is going to speak just very, very little. This really is the work of Mike. He has done an absolutely terrific job. I'm blessed to work with incredibly bright people at MIT, but this one stands out in a big way. That said, a lot of people have been whispering in our ears about this small community air service issue. And you know, I've been out there and I speak a lot about 40% of the airports comprise 97% of demand. What are we doing with an airport system that is so big? Should an airport system not consolidate as an industry consolidates? These are all significant questions, and the market is beginning to play itself out a little bit. The study Mike will go through, really what it is the study is intended to do is inform the debate that I think is about to ensue. And for those of you who have been here all week, you have heard lots about pilot supply issues, you have heard lots about regulatory issues, and these are all to have an effect on what size the regional industry may be going forward. So with that said, we wanted to just put something out, put some numbers to it. This is a first in a series of papers we're going to do. The second one will come out in a few weeks. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to kind of peel through some slides and walk you through what we found. Thanks.
So thanks very much, Bill. And thanks also to Faye, to Roger, to Kelly Murphy, everyone else at RAA and Emerald Media. Faye sort of alluded to it, but they did a big job in helping us put this study together. We met with them several times while we were sort of in development with the process of the study, and their questions, their feedback, their commentary all helped do a great deal to improve the quality of what we put out. So thanks very much to them as well. So, you know, when I normally talk about my work, I usually put up slides like this because my audiences aren't usually so coached in how important small community air service and regional air service is to the US air transportation network. But even still, I think it's interesting to look at a map like this. This is just a map of every single airport in the United States that has service, at least one service from a 37 to 50 seat regional jet. And as you can see, there's many of them, including each and every one of the top 30 largest airports in the United States have service from just this one type of jet alone. And there's hundreds of others ranging from the smallest towns to the largest communities. And for some airports, these are the only types of aircraft that they service. I think there's about 100 airports on this map that only receive service from, again, 37 to 50 seat prop planes and regional jets. If you were to expand that number to, or those types of aircraft to include smaller Cessnas and Beechcraft or even larger regional jets, you would add hundreds of more airports to this list. So I think it really goes to show how regional air service really provides the glue that holds together the seams of the U.S. air transportation network. And without it, as you know, Roger and others today have shown, there's a lot of communities that just would have a very different air transportation landscape without the impact of regional airlines and regional jets. That being said, this, as we've heard from Dan Garton this morning, this industry has tremendous challenges that face it. It's particularly with this segment of the industry. You know, Dan talked about 3 this morning. I think we have 8 up here. We could probably brainstorm dozens more. So these range from operational considerations about what's going to happen if the 50-seat regional jet continues to stay in service or not, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Economic considerations of what's happening with high and volatile fuel prices, what's happening, is all the regional flying going to continue to stay in the market, and is there enough local demand in a lot of these small communities to continue to show growth and enough economic support to stabilize this type of service. There's strategic considerations as well, so whether we're looking at capacity discipline, which we're going to talk a lot about today, or just the prevalence of ULCCs and ultra low-cost carriers and other low-cost carriers in these markets. There's a big change in the types of airlines that serve small communities, and we'll take a look at that as well. And of course, the legislative piece, whether it be flight time, duty time, whether it be 1,500-hour rule, whether it be sequestration, whether it has to deal with contract towers, or just having enough financial support to fund the air transportation network. These are all really important strategic considerations to consider when you're looking at what's going to happen not only in the last 6 years with small community air service, but continuing forward to the next 5 or 6 years and trying to predict where this industry might go. So it's been very surprising to me as an academic, or at least someone who pretends to be one, how little academic research there's been on small community air service and on regional airlines. I'm writing my thesis on some of these topics, and trying to go and do a thorough literature review has been really challenging because the types of studies that are out there typically only focus on the largest airlines, only focus on the largest airports, and there's been comparatively little analysis of this sector of the industry, which again makes up such a large percentage of the airports in the United States that receive service. So Bill and I are hoping to change that. We've started up the MIT Small Community Air Service White Paper Series, and the purpose of this is to provide a data-driven, industry-focused and also economically focused and impartial, or at least as impartial as we can get with Swellbar involved, look at how small community air service has existed over the last 5 years and continues to change over the next 5 to 10 years. So today's talk is going to talk about the first one of these papers, as Faye mentioned, Trends in Market Forces Shaping Small Community Air Service in the US. This paper is available as of this morning. You can get to it from the MIT International Center for Air Transportation, or ICAT, website. So you can either memorize this sort of complicated URL or just remember MIT ICAT, ICAT. Google that, and you should be able to get a link to the study and the paper. As Bill also alluded to, we're working on a second paper on changes in connectivity at US airports. So in this paper, we're making up a new connectivity model to measure how well connected airports are to the global air transportation network. So we're really excited about this. It's going to be able to rank airports from 1 to 500 or something throughout the United States, and you'll be able to see how your hometown airport has changed in terms of its connectivity over the last couple years. So we're excited about that paper. Again, it's probably going to come out in June. So what's the point of this paper, and what's the point of today's talk? The idea behind the Trends in Market Forces paper was to look at essentially 3 large macroeconomic and macro strategic events over the last 6 years and see what their impacts have been on the small community air service sector of the industry. So those events or forces are the global economic downturn. We put 2007 to 2010. I think it's very easy to argue that you could continue up to 2011 or even through to today. And then coupled with that, high and volatile fuel prices. So both of these things together made operating regional jets, as I'm sure you all know, very challenging. But for me, so it's not very surprising that if we have these two downward economic events, so in other words, what we'd say in economics is a demand shock. If we have this demand shock, basic economics would tell us that we should expect a reduction in capacity as a result of that demand shock. So that's not really surprising, and we'll see that capacity did indeed fall from 2007 to 2010. For me, what the most interesting part of this study is looking at even after the economy started to improve, even after some of the fundamentals started getting better, airlines still left their capacity, I would say, arbitrarily and deliberately low. So the buzzword here is capacity discipline. This is what we're calling it at MIT, and I think that phrase has been coming throughout the industry as well. So trying to look at the impacts of capacity discipline, especially in the last couple years, and looking at how it affected individual airports and also larger trends within the industry is something we want to focus on here. Looking not only at the quantity of capacity in terms of flights and seats, but also the mix of aircraft and also which airlines end up serving these markets. These are all interesting questions we want to take a look at. So with any academic study, we need good data, of course, and we're pretty blessed to have a great data set provided from our friends at DOME. We have their airline schedule data, which comes from their market intelligence portal. We get information about marketing carrier, O&D, equipment, flights, seats, ASMs, and it really has worldwide coverage. So this helps when we're trying to do some global air transportation work. So we're slicing this up into yearly pieces to look at for our analysis here. And then just one final note before we get into the actual data. I'm going to be referring several times throughout the presentation to these hub types, these FAA hub types. And many of you probably know what these are, but in case you don't, it's sort of important to figure out what's going on here. So the FAA basically assigns each airport in the United States with one of these hub definitions based solely on how many passengers they enplaned in the previous year. So the large hubs, as they call them, are all airports that got more than 1% of the total flights, or total enplanements, I should say, in the last year. So it's sort of unfortunate that the word hub is used because in the airline industry, the word hub has a very specific connotation of what that means. In this case, it's more of a descriptive term. So we have small hubs like Syracuse. So of course, Syracuse isn't a connecting hub for any major carrier, but it's still recognized as a hub. So when I say large hub, medium hub, small hub, just think of large airport, small airport, medium-sized airport. Don't get too tied up by the hub definition. Okay. So let's start with a broad overview of what's going on. We'll take the biggest look possible at first, and then we'll start slicing the data in different ways as we go through this little journey through small community air service to see what some of the trends and market forces are. All right, so the big picture, here's what it is. So this is just a graph of scheduled domestic departures from US airports over the last 6 years. And it's broken up that the red bars are the large hub flights, the gray bars are the flights from all other 433 smaller, medium-sized, small-sized airports. So a couple trends to note here. One of the things to notice is that the trend is downward, as I mentioned earlier, and it's consistently downward, particularly in the last couple years. So we've lost about 1.3 or 1.4 million flights that have been removed from the US air transportation system over these years, all domestically. So we've gone from about 9.8 million total to about 8.3 million or so. The other thing to notice is that the relative size of the red bar is starting to increase over time. So what's happening here is the percentage of flights as a percentage of total that are being operated from the large hubs are starting to increase from about 56% in 2007 to about 59% today. So what's going on there is that these are airports that, it's a pattern of airline consolidation at their largest hubs, essentially. So as flights have been being cut from all airports, there's been a disproportionate cut from the smaller and mid-sized airports. And we can particularly see that if we just take a look at those gray bars alone. So what I've done here is just basically taken those gray bars from the previous slide and sliced them up again into medium hub, small hub, non-hub, and EAS, or essential air service markets. So these are markets or airports that are funded by the Essential Air Service federal subsidy program. And the table on the bottom right really says it all here. So if you were to ask me sort of a priority what I would have expected this to look like, I would have thought that as is happening here, the least number of flights would have been cut from the large hubs. I think the large hubs have done reasonably well throughout the whole economic downturn. So that's something that we see in the data as well. But what's interesting to me is that the medium hubs, and not the smallest airports, but these mid-sized airports, are the ones that have gotten hurt the most by the economic downturn, capacity discipline, what have you. So we have a little story of why this is, and I think the story involves Southwest Airlines. So if you're thinking about what the medium hubs are, these are airports like Oakland, California, San Jose, California, Love Field in Dallas, Texas, Providence, Rhode Island. These are all airports that Southwest Airlines in the late 90s and early 2000s started to build up as alternatives for passengers in multi-airport regions to go to instead of crowding into the large hubs that all the network carriers have started moving into. So I'm from the Boston area, so I remember in the early 2000s a lot of marketing to try to push Logan passengers away to Manchester or away to Providence. So this worked very well for a time. Southwest was doing very well. The network carriers in response started to reduce some capacity in those markets because they couldn't compete with Southwest on frequency and they couldn't compete on price. So that is all well and good if Southwest continues to put capacity into those markets. But as we'll see in a second, what's happened is that Southwest has started practicing some capacity discipline on its own. So when Southwest starts doing capacity discipline, and when the network carriers are doing capacity discipline, that can be a real painful experience for the medium hubs that were built up by this sort of service. So that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this 26% drop in scheduled domestic flights at medium hubs. If you ask the question about who's actually doing the flights, is it the network carriers and their regional affiliates, or is it some of the other airlines? You'll see that it's really the network carriers. And by network carriers here, I mean network carriers as marketing airlines. So that includes all of the regional affiliates that fly under a network carrier flag, essentially, are in that red bar. So they've had an enormous drop in flights. About 27% of their scheduled domestic flights have been cut from the system over the last 6 years. And I'm sure that's something that all the regional airlines here are certainly feeling. On the flip side, the blue bar, which represents low-cost carriers like Southwest and JetBlue, ultra low-cost carriers, so ULCCs, those are the Spirits, the Allegiant, Sun Country, and what we're calling ultra regionals. So these are the Cape Airs, Great Lakes, Big Sky, Silver, Commute Air. These types of airlines have actually been growing as a whole over this period. But what's interesting is that they still make up a relatively small percentage of the overall flights from smaller airports. It's still very much a network carrier and a regional airline affiliate game in these types of airports. I mentioned Southwest a second ago. The title of the slide, I think, really says it all. Is it time to call Southwest a legacy carrier? And I think the answer is yes, looking at the data. And it's been interesting for me to see, especially over the last couple months as we've been hearing a lot of this American Airlines, US Airways merger talk, the CEOs of those airlines going in front of Congress and talking about the big four. So including, along with the New American, Delta, and United, including Southwest in that category of network carrier and legacy carrier. This is all very new. That was not part of the parlance before. So I think it's coming around in the industry to start referring to Southwest as a legacy or network carrier. And indeed, they are practicing capacity discipline just like the network carriers are. They've cut about 10% of their flights from smaller airports over the last 6 years. Meanwhile, they're entering the larger networks, larger airports, as I alluded to earlier. So flights at those large airports, at the large hubs, are up by 6%. So while they're cutting 10% of flights from smaller airports, flights from larger airports are up by 6%, and they've entered 7 new large hub airports. So I think they serve something like 23 of the 29 largest airports in the US now. A really big change to their strategic model. So which are any airlines doing well? Are they increasing flights to smaller airports? And I think that the general answer is that I would say most LCCs, ULCCs, and ultra-regionals are building up capacity and building up service at smaller airports. So I've just selected 4 to put on here. JetBlue, of course, doing very well. Frontier, some very steady growth until recently. Spirit Airlines and Allegiant, particularly Allegiant, I mean, that's an interesting airline. That's an airline that has a network that's as large as JetBlue's, serving a lot of small communities, has a huge footprint, but has something like half the capacity that JetBlue has. So they're continuing to grow, but again, keep in mind the scale here. So these airlines are, while they're serving these small communities, only offering pretty reduced frequencies to them. So again, as I said earlier, this is still a network carrier and regional affiliate game in these types of airports, and the scale of this graph sort of shows that. One good trend, though, for regional carriers, and I know Roger loves this slide, this just shows how the network carriers have started shifting service from mainline to regional at their smaller airports. So if you're on a United flight departing from a small airport, 7 out of 8 times you're going to be flying a regional jet operated by a regional affiliate of United. And that proportion has actually increased in the favor of regional jets over the last 6 years. The same thing's happened at the US Airways America West split. American and Delta have been sort of flat over the period. We think that they're going to start changing that percentage as scope clauses change, as they start buying new aircraft. They've been really excited about the 76-seat regional jet, it appears. So we think that as that merger starts happening, the combined American-US Airways number is going to start getting a little bit closer, maybe to the 80% regional range or so. So essential air service, here's another, I mean, there's so many interesting markets to look at in this arena. So essential air service, this used to be, again, a network carrier and regional affiliate game. Almost, you know, I would say 75% or more of the service, especially historically, was being provided by these types of airlines. What's happened recently? We've gone to this incredible situation where, while in 2007, the regional affiliates of network carriers provided something like 75% of the service to essential air service markets where federal subsidies were provided to induce service, now Cape Air and Great Lakes alone serve more essential air service flights than do all of the network carriers, the regional affiliates of all the network carriers combined. And by a substantial margin, almost twice as many. So this is a real change in the way this industry, or this segment of the market works. And I think that this really comes down to a gauge issue. You know, what's the right gauge to fly in an essential air service market? It's probably not going to be a huge regional jet. It's certainly not a mainline carrier, that's for sure, mainline aircraft. And you can see in this slide sort of some of the tries of network carriers and the ways they've experimented with serving different types of aircraft in these EAS markets. The gray bar being small propeller planes, those have started falling off. The blue bar being smaller, you know, Beechcraft and Cessnas, those have fallen off. The blue bar is almost entirely SkyWest. So SkyWest is starting to put 50-seat regional jets into essential air service markets. So that's a very interesting strategy, and we're interested to see how that plays out. Again, but it's sort of hard to see how, in the long term, regional airlines are going to be able to make this work. It really seems like the correct gauge for this is going to be the 8 to 19-seat regional jets, or smaller airplanes that the ultra-regional carriers are providing. So speaking of gauge, this story really, or this study started as a look into the 50-seat regional jet. Bill came to me and said, I want to do a study on what's been happening to the 50-seat regional jet, because we've been hearing all of these rumors and insinuations floating around that this jet was doomed, that it was going to start being removed from you know, the capacity was going to start falling off the map, that it was too expensive to operate with high fuel prices, that basically we're expected to see tons of collapse within this market, and that the smallest communities were going to get hit the hardest by this jet being removed from the market so quickly. The data shows some different stories. One is that the sky isn't falling with 50-seat regional jets. They're not being totally removed from all of these markets. It is true that they're coming out of medium hubs very quickly. So the gray bar shows a significant decline in medium hub service of 50-seat regional jets. But what's interesting to me, maybe one of the most interesting things about the study, is that blue bar, the dark blue of the non-hubs. So these are the smallest communities and the ones that you would have expected. If 50-seat regional jets start getting pulled because they're too expensive to operate or whatever, you would imagine that the smallest communities would be the ones to be hit first, the very smallest communities, the non-hubs. But instead what we see is that even throughout the economic downturn, throughout capacity discipline, throughout high fuel prices and challenging economics to operate these types of jets, the blue line basically stays flat. So that service that's been maintained to non-hub, the very smallest communities, that service from 50-seat regional jets has basically continued unabated and unchanged over the last 6 years. So for us, that's a very interesting conclusion and sort of calls into question some of these assumptions that have been made previously about what's going on with the 50-seat regional jet and how that's changing over time. And you know, looking at the 76-seat regional jet, because you know, of course, there's been some upgauging. So some of that decline over here on the medium hubs is coming back in the medium hubs in the form of 76-seat regional jets. So potentially, what's happening is maybe 2 50-seat departures are being taken out and replaced by a single 76-seat departure. That's happened in a lot of markets. So that sort of trade is pretty good for an airline that can operate a more efficient aircraft, operate fewer departures, and still get maybe only a 25% decline in capacity in terms of seats as opposed to a 50% decline if they just would have cut one of those flights entirely. But that's leveled off over time. So we've seen about a 19% increase in 76-seat, so 51 to 76-seat regional jet flights, but that's sort of been flat. Again, we expect this to grow pretty substantially over the next couple of years in response to scope clauses changing and airlines starting to buy more 76-seat regional jets. Okay, so to sort of close off, we wanted to ask some questions about what airports might still be vulnerable for future losses in service over the next 5 years. And it's sort of an interesting question of trying to define what vulnerability means and trying to figure out exactly what the definition of a phrase like that, it's a very sexy phrase, vulnerable airports, but trying to identify what exactly that means in this context is sort of challenging. So what we decided to do, and I'll skip this, is just go to a map of all the airports that lost all of their network carrier, and again, by network carrier, I also mean regional affiliate of network carrier service, over the last 6 years. And as you can see, they're all over the map. They serve communities of different sizes in different geographic regions. So you look at a map like this and you sort of try to put the pieces together of why all of these airports are in this category. And we sort of have, I guess, 3 categories that we can group these airports into, sort of a taxonomy of small community air service. So what are they? So one possibility for these types of airports that lost all their network carrier service is that they just don't have enough demand. I mean, that's, to be frank, some of the airports just are in geographic regions and demographic regions that just don't have enough demand to support commercial air service without a subsidy. So we'll look at an example of each of these. Some of them might be really close to nearby large hubs or in multi-airport regions with a lot of airport choice, and it's harder and harder for airport managers at these smaller airports to be able to convince passengers that it makes more sense to go to your smaller airport as opposed to, you know, driving just a few minutes or a few miles away to a larger competitor where you have more flights and more frequencies. And the other thing is the ULCCs, especially Allegiant, Spirit, these have been real game changers and real disruptive forces in this industry segment. So if there's an LCC or ULCC either in your market already or knocking at your door, that can sometimes be a death knell for your regional airline or network affiliate service. So what's one example of each of these? So lack of demand, Farmington, New Mexico. So this is an airport that's in, I think, the northwest corner of New Mexico. And what I've done here is I've drawn a 50-mile catchment area around the airport so you can see what's going on. It's sort of hard to see on this map, but there's little black dots that represent the population centers in this area. And the fact that there's basically none within that catchment area sort of tell the whole story. Markets like this just don't have enough people living in the area to be able to support commercial air service without a subsidy. So here's an example of an airport that would need an essential air service grant to continue to receive commercial air service because otherwise the economics of it probably just aren't there. Contrast that with an airport like Trenton, which also lost all of its network carrier service over the last 6 years. What's happening here, you can see all the black dots. I mean, the 50-mile catchment area around Trenton includes all of New Jersey, so that's millions of people within that state alone, not to mention parts of Pennsylvania and New York and Long Island. But the problem is, in that catchment area, in that 50 miles alone, you've got Philly, you've got Newark, you've got LaGuardia, JFK. So if you're a business traveler or anyone flying out of that area, we found a lot of people would just decide to go to Philadelphia instead of going to Trenton to get their service. So when you have such a congested area with so many airports in one region, the smaller airports really start to struggle. That being said, there are still some economic rationales to enter one of these markets. So, network carriers came out of Trenton. What happened recently? Frontier Airlines steps in and says, hey, we're going to offer 10 destinations or something like that out of Trenton. And they've stepped into Wilmington as well. So I don't think the lights are probably going to stay on at these types of airports because there's just too much demand in the area to have no service at all. But as far as the types of airlines that provide service there, those might start changing over the next 5 years. And then the airports with presence of ULCCs, so I've chosen Bellingham, Washington. A lot of these airports have interesting geographic features that make them particularly appealing to ULCCs. So Bellingham is very close to the Canadian border, so there's been some rebranding of this as Bellingham/Vancouver International Airport, as being sort of branded as this alternative gateway to Canada. So instead of flying to Vancouver, you'd fly to Bellingham and drive up. So I think that was something that Allegiant did. So again, as I mentioned earlier, when a ULCC is knocking at the door and offering lower fares, it can be challenging for network carriers to continue and affiliates to continue to compete. So that's what we're seeing in a lot of these airports. Sort of put all that together, and you get the sort of image that comes to mind of a sort of typical airport that might have issues retaining its commercial air service over the next 5 years. So you look at Toledo, Ohio, for instance. Poor Toledo. So Toledo lost 75% of their service over the last 6 years. They had a lot of Delta service. Delta merges with Northwest. They get Detroit, and all of a sudden it doesn't make as much sense to provide a lot of service out of Toledo if people can just drive less than 50 miles up to Detroit and fly out of that hub airport instead. So they cut a ton of flights out of Toledo. American Eagle, I think, is still in there flying to Chicago, but who's knocking at the door? ULCCs are showing up and saying, we're going to offer flights to Florida and flights to other vacation destinations. So an airport like this that's in a multi-airport region, one in which there's only one network carrier left, or maybe there's been a network carrier that just recently exited, and where ULCCs are showing a lot of interest or activity, these are the types of airports that we might think are going to be at future risk for losing all their network carrier affiliate service over the next 5 years. So you can sort of look at the airports in your region and draw your own conclusions about if they fit this sort of risk profile of airports that might fall into this trap of losing all their network carrier service. And the reason that matters, The reason it matters that airports are losing network carrier and regional affiliate service is that that type of service, the service provided by regional airlines flying for network carriers, giving, on flights to large hubs, is the best way for those airports to get connectivity to the global air transportation network. That's a fact. I mean, compare network carrier, regional carrier service to ULCC service, and the connectivity is a real mismatch in the favor of regional airlines. Being able to have service to an Atlanta, to a Dallas, or any of these big connecting hubs is going to give you essentially one-stop connections from your small community to essentially wherever you want to go in the world. So that's why that service is so valuable. And that's also why we've started to look into connectivity. And we're, as I mentioned at the beginning, Bill and I are working on this study on connectivity at small community airports, looking at how airlines or airports are affected once capacity starts getting cut, once destinations start changing, once the types of aircraft or airlines that start serving these markets start to change. There can be real changes in connectivity. So again, the study is going to probably be coming out in June. What's going to be cool about this is we can start answering questions like, if a network carrier or a regional affiliate leaves a market, what sort of percentage change do we have in connectivity, and sort of do a broad spectrum of analysis over that. So we can do some pretty cool analysis with this kind of connectivity model. So we're excited to share this all with you probably next month. So where does this leave us? Where are we in the next 5 years? So our little tagline here is that small community airports we expect to continue to go quiet but not dark. So it's still a fairly rare event for an airport to lose all commercial service entirely and stay that way for years on end. There are only a handful of such airports in our study period, even through the recession, even through high fuel prices, even through capacity discipline, through all of that. There's only a few airports that actually lost all service and still lack commercial air service. So usually what happens is that a network carrier will leave, a ULCC will show up, or an ultra-regional will show up. So we expect this trend to continue over the next 5 years. That being said, there are some potential shocks that can come into that system. Legislatively, if there is a pilot shortage as a result of a 1,500-hour rule or flight time, duty time, or what have you, if you start thinking about what the effects of, we've heard different numbers over the course of the event of what that would mean in terms of capacity. If you start thinking about even what a 10% cut in capacity would do to these types of airports, that's more flights coming out of medium hubs, that's more connectivity being lost in small hubs and non-hubs, and potentially more essential air service markets being either turned over to ultra-regionals or just being removed entirely. And I think they're also taking, Faye's our EAS expert, but I think they're also taking a look at essential air service and what sort of funding that program will get in the future in the spectrum of all this budget cutting. So as a final point, maybe we can talk about this more in the Q&A, all of this analysis sort of is predicated on this idea that capacity discipline, this idea that airlines are maintaining deliberately lower levels of capacity because they've had more profitability doing so, that's going to continue over the next 5 years. And I look at this as in a game theoretic context and sort of an economic context. And I wonder whether capacity discipline is a stable equilibrium or not. So by that I mean, is it in everyone's best interest to continue to restrict capacity, or is someone out there going to say, hey, everyone else has low capacity, I'm going to start ramping up my capacity, gain more market share, and then the whole equilibrium and the whole structure sort of breaks down. So if we move into an equilibrium that's not capacity discipline anymore, but instead is market share competition or network competition, which is plausible, you can think of that as being possible, because if we have 4 big carriers and they're all trying to compete on size of their network, you can see a scenario in which this would happen. Maybe that's actually going to be a good thing for small communities, because then everyone tries to get the biggest network possible, so they're going to start moving into these communities, and you might see more service in these markets. But capacity discipline's worked out pretty well for people so far. Profitability has been very good. We don't see any trend right now of reversal in this type of market, in this strategy. So we'll have to pay attention the next couple of years to see if we have any capacity discipline stability or not, and maybe we can talk about some of the reasons why that may or may not be the case. So that's it for the formal stuff. I know Bill and I are really excited to take your questions here. If you have any questions about Small Community White Paper Series or the MIT Airline Industry Research Consortium, I'll make a plug for that. So we have an interdisciplinary group of airports, airlines, trade councils, organizations, OEMs, a lot of airline industry folks who are really interested in trying to be a part of the conversation of the research agenda of MIT. So they get together and we give them our research and help shape what people like me do. So if you're interested in trying to get some more information about that or becoming part of the MIT Airline Industry Research Consortium, you can send me an email and I can get you in contact with our program manager who can tell you, what some of the details of that are. Otherwise, if you have questions about or comments about the presentation, about the paper, I really encourage you to go on the ICAT website and take a look at it and let us know if you have any questions or comments. Otherwise, our email addresses are up there. They're just our last names at mit.edu, and we really encourage you to contact us and let us know what you think. So with that, I think we'll head back to the Q&A and we'll see what you have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mike and Bill. We're going to open it up to the audience for some questions and answers, but before we do that, I'm going to take the facilitator's prerogative to start off with the first question and maybe get what I think may be the hardest for you to answer, at least with some precision. But I think it's a question that has to be asked, which is, all morning we heard the various stakeholders in this industry talk about the challenges facing us and the not insignificant challenge of the regulatory environment. And you touched on it in your talk as the legislative regulatory aspect that could stand to change things. But with the increased demand for and decreased supply of pilots that most of us in this industry expect, can you predict with any degree of accuracy what the impact might be? Have you accounted for that in your study, and is it possible to project that out?
I think what it is that we're trying to do here is identify those airports that are vulnerable in the event of additional shocks to the system. And certainly that would be an additional shock. There are some doomsday forecasts out there that we could see as many as 500 units need to be pulled down because there just will not be sufficient pilots out there. I mean, that's a draconian number, but you can make that case. So what it is that I think the study enables you to do, and ultimately it's the June piece that I think is going to add a tremendous amount to the body of work, where it is you can see where those airports where the network carriers have been shying away from service already, you can kind of begin to see them as vulnerable and kind of work up that list from bottom to top.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest question is, what the scale of this sort of event is going to be. I think Bill sort of touched on that. We have a whole range of forecasts, and even within this event, even among the people who are within the industry and or who are best connected with this, you still can't get two people to agree on what the impact would be and what the time frame of it would be. So unless we understand that first, then we can start thinking about, okay, so if we know there's going to be, and I frame it in the terms of what % of capacity is potentially going to be taken out of the system. If we start thinking, if we have a good forecast of what sort of capacity is going to be taken out of the system, I think then we can start asking questions about what sort of markets are going to be hit hardest by that reduction in capacity, and whether it's going to be the medium hubs, the small hubs, or the very smallest airports. And it's probably going to be a combination of them, and I would hazard a guess to say it's probably going to be also on the low end, because a lot of the capacity has already been taken out of the medium hubs. I'm not sure how much farther those airports have to go in terms of, I think there's a floor, in other words, of capacity there, because if you start taking service out too much, someone's going to jump in and provide more. That's sort of what we've seen here. So it depends on scale, I think, is the issue.
Before I continue, any questions from the audience? There are a couple of mics throughout the room, so please walk up to the mic and Scott.
Thank you for bringing the information. It's very interesting. I know you put a lot of work into it, and it's much appreciated. Earlier this week, we heard presentations from Kent Lovelace at UND talking about pilot supply specifically, and one of his projections and trends is that we're in about 5 years is when the industry may see a delta between supply and demand. That's when we're already seeing stress in trying to find enough pilots for the regionals, but that it might become, I won't describe it as a cliff, but could become much more difficult in about 5 years. And then when I saw that you expect that the network carriers in particular are going to exhibit capacity constraints for the next 5 years, I wonder what happens after that 5 years. Do you foresee the carriers actually adding capacity at that point, or is there no vision beyond that point? Because I worry about those two trends, maybe increasing capacity for economic reasons clashing with the fact that we don't have enough pilots to fuel that demand.
Yeah. Can I take that first?
As it's my birthday and I get older, I will admit to you that I didn't hear the entire question. Ears are starting to go a little bad, but The trend out there is pretty clear right now. We're seeing upgauging. So, it just seems that we are moving to a system where we're going to see more bigger airplanes out there flown by the mainline carriers particularly. And I am one that wants to stand back and watch what it is that Delta is going to do with the 717s and the increased number of 76-seat jets as they put the 50-seat jet down, and see how it is that network evolves, because I think it's going to drive a lot of thinking at the other network carriers as to just where it is that they go. So that would suggest that we begin to see a regionalization of airports where, I have a catchment area and I likely don't need 5 airports inside that catchment area. If I'm in Fort Wayne, I may drive to Indianapolis, that kind of thing. So I think that could help to address some of the pilot shortage as well as air service consolidates its way around some of the bigger, small airports.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point too, that I think one of the debates that can be coming out of this study and some of our other work is thinking about the really loaded question of what communities deserve, in quotes, air service, what airports deserve to have commercial air service, whether that's economic or if someone's going to make a political or social case for that. That's a hard question to answer. That's a question that you ask anyone, you ask a politician, you ask an airline exec, you ask the commuter, you ask the guy at the check-in desk. These are all people are going to have different answers about that. And I think that the pilot shortage, if it happens, is going to basically force us to have those debates about what communities actually deserve the service more quickly than otherwise it would have happened. It takes these shocks to the system like that to really have impetus for action for people to start saying, well, we're going to have to start making decisions about whether all five airports in that Trenton area are going to continue to get service or not, and if not, which specific ones are going to be the ones that are going to lose service. And I'm pretty sure those airports wouldn't go down without a fight either. So
I think it's akin to those who determined that Lehman Brothers should be the one that was closed.
John.
I was wondering if you guys have done anything on service levels or the decline in service levels between smaller and medium cities.
yeah.
I noticed you had a graph on service that was lost, network service that was lost by city size.
Yeah.
But in between smaller and medium cities, it seems to me there used to be a lot more service that's disappeared.
It's been decimated. I mean, that type of service is, with very few exceptions, almost completely gone. So it used to be that you could get from Reno to Boise, and that sort of service just doesn't exist anymore. With the sole exception that the couple carriers that seem to be doing a pretty good job of it are the ultra regionals. So Cape Air, for instance. Cape Air, I think, has service from Albany to some airports in northern New York, using, again, very small 8 to 19 seat aircraft. So there's still a place for it in the market, but in terms of that kind of service being provided by regional affiliates of network carriers, you're right that it's almost completely gone, and that's driving a lot of the reductions at medium hubs, but particularly at small hubs. A lot of that small hub to small hub service is just being wiped off entirely. So you have a lot of cases where at a small hub, you might actually get more service to a large hub, as a percentage of the total, but your overall number is down because you're losing the service that used to exist between those cities. So you're exactly right that trend is something that we're seeing, and it's driving a lot of that, the graph that you mentioned.
One of the things that we found very interesting about the study, and I don't know if you shared this, but going into it when you first started to brief us about this, we really expected, I think, things to look worse. So I don't know how much you were surprised by what you found,
yeah.
But given the substantial challenges that we've already been facing, not least of which being the fuel prices, we really thought some of the capacity drawdowns would be worse. We thought the results and findings here would be worse. So what would you classify as the mitigating factors? I mean, what are the top 1 or 2 marketplace forces at work?
I think that's an awesome question. And, we know that fuel had such a negative effect on the operating economics of the 50-seat platform. We just accept that. But what it is that we didn't expect was that over the last couple of years, also a major cost driver during that time were maintenance costs. And we've seen the market help to address maintenance costs on the smaller airplanes. We've seen capital costs come down on those airplanes. So maintenance costs coming down, capital costs coming down, mitigating the increase in the fuel risk was, I think, leading us to this place where we've seen a 20% reduction. It looks like we've kind of stabilized here, and absent an additional shock, we probably operate here for some time.
I think maybe another interesting thing is that a lot of airports are starting to, as Bill likes to say, open their checkbooks to get more service. So we've been seeing a lot of airports starting to hire consultants or try to sort of do it on their own to offer things like revenue guarantees or waiving landing fees or giving free advertising, things like this. Packages that are often within the millions of dollars, and I've heard different estimates. Sometimes I've heard different airlines saying you need $2 or $3 million to be able to have a play here. So what's going to happen is you have a lot of these airports that are putting in $3 million out of their pocket to try to get service. I'm thinking of Worcester Airport, Worcester, Massachusetts, was near where I grew up. So they got they were knocking on JetBlue's door for years with this revenue guarantee. They finally took it in, and now they have service. So they'll try the service out. If it works, great. Now there's a new profitable route in the system. And what's interesting is that if it doesn't work, the airlines have shown absolutely no mercy with just stopping service entirely. So there's a lot of airports that I can think of that have had someone came in and tried service for less than a year, and then after, a year goes by and they say, it's not for me, we're pulling out and just leaving that airport dark again. But that sort of churn, someone always seems to be willing to try it. That's the thing. I think that's what's keeping service not as low as what Faye would have suggested. Someone's always willing to step in and give it a go. And if it works out, great. If it doesn't, well, especially if you're in a revenue guarantee, no harm done. So I think that's sort of also what's happening along with the maintenance.
Not only with respect to air service, but also how it is that we fund airports going forward. I think there's going to be a term that we all know, but is going to become an important part of the vernacular, and it's called public-private partnerships. And I think that we're going to see communities end up having to have some skin in the game in order to retain service and get some of the projects done at their airports in order to retain that service. And so I think that we're headed down a path where that is going to become a part of the discussion and a way of doing business.
Just following on to that, so we've heard just in the last hour some of the bad news, but then you've just said there's going to be airplanes that are available that are good airplanes that are going to be available cheap, that there's markets that are going to be needed to be served, that the cost of that service can come down, that the communities will need to have some skin in the game and make an investment in it. Isn't that a great opportunity for some operator to come in with that aircraft and fly Boise to Reno or Dayton to Oklahoma City to Tucson, Dayton to Washington? Those aren't small markets, and someone could probably make a pretty good profit doing that. What do you think?
I'm not sold on Boise, Reno, Roger, but what it is that I am sold on is the network carriers would prefer not to get any smaller than they are today. I mean, the hub and spoke system needs the feed, and to the extent that those networks can be retained. Now, do I think somebody's going to come along and try something? Probably. But, let's just accept the fact that the barriers to entry are a lot higher, and capital is expensive and fuel is volatile, and capital is a lot smarter today than it was 10 years ago.
Mike and Bill, thank you very much for spending this time with us today. If you haven't had a chance to read the full white paper, I encourage you to do so behind some of this research, because it's just an incredibly thorough piece of work, very informative, and in some ways very reassuring, although I have to say that given the regulatory climate right now, we hope that it doesn't become Exhibit A in what might have been had there not been a punitive regulatory environment. But nonetheless, it's reassuring and it's good information. So thank you for that, and thank you for spending some time. And Bill, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Faye, Roger, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.